Some are saying that tariffs are a great thing. You know, it makes America stronger and protects our industrial base. Let's begin at the beginning. Why is trade important?
Well, trade is important because it gives American firms access to global markets. It gives U.S. consumers access to global markets. A basic concept of economics is that trade, voluntary trade, is always win-win and makes both parties better off. So from an economic standpoint, to create the most amount of wealth and prosperity and jobs, what we want to do is maximize the amount of trading opportunities that are available both on the buying side and on the selling side. So it's very clear from an economic standpoint, using economic theory, empirical evidence, that economists are pretty united on this one topic. They might differ or diverge on other topics, but economists as a group pretty much have unanimous support for the benefits of free trade, and they're almost universally and unanimously opposed to restrictions on trade in the form of protectionism and tariffs. So trade is just a way that we increase our opportunities, and it enhances our standard of living and gets us to a much higher level of prosperity and a higher standard of living.
The vast majority of the American people, do they benefit from trade?
Yes, of course. And I think one way to, I always encourage people to look at trade through the viewpoint of the consumer, because all we hear out of Washington and Trump and the protectionists is through the viewpoint of the producer. So especially if you view international trade from the viewpoint of the American consumer, we're much better off today getting access to low-cost goods from all over the world. And so especially from the consumer standpoint, the opportunities we have to shop around the world, basically, that really elevates the standard of living of every American who buys anything at a Target or a Walmart or a Home Depot or travels abroad. And so really, especially from the consumer standpoint, Americans are much better off with trade compared to the alternative, which would be protectionism or reductions in international trade.
And of course, if the American people didn't want to participate in trade, then we wouldn't have the Walmarts and these supermarkets, and we wouldn't have all these things that we have today, because there'd be no need for them, would there?
Well, right. And we kind of get a little bit off base here, because we always talk about like the U.S. and maybe a deficit with China or Japan or Canada or Mexico, but countries don't trade. Individuals trade. So I think that's also very important for people to understand. The trade happens at the individual level, that the United States doesn't decide to go on vacation to Canada or vice versa. It's American tourists that might decide to go on vacation there. So trade always happens at the individual level. From economic theory and just economic reasoning and logic, trade is win-win. And so we want to, again, to maximize the amount of trade, and individuals engage in trade. And that's where I think we have to always think of the consumer as the viewpoint of the consumer is what's important in trade.
What does fair trade mean? I'm having a little trouble wrapping my head around this. What does that mean exactly?
Usually when I hear people use the word fair trade, that translates into protectionism for some U.S. industries or some U.S. companies, that they're usually people who use that term, they don't really want free trade. In their perception, they view trade as somehow being unfair, that foreign producers are somehow undercutting American producers, or they're dumping goods here. And so usually when we hear people, from my experience, talk about fair trade, what they really want is some protectionism for American producers or American industries.
Well, let me give you an example. The President's been talking about dairy in Canada. And I don't know if this is accurate, it may well be. Let's say it is. 270% tariff that the Canadians put on dairy products that we seek to ship into Canada. First of all, a tariff is a tax, is that right?
That's right.
So they're taxing their own people.
Right.
On the price of eggs and milk and butter, cheese, dairy products. So the Canadian government, at least theoretically, is doing that to protect their dairy markets. Does that help us, hurt us? Does that help them, hurt them?
Well, I mean, I would say in general, as a country, Canada's tariffs on average are lower than America, so they're more of a free market trading nation, I think, than the U.S. But if we look at a specific example, and of course the U.S., we pay twice the world price for sugar because we protect our sugar
Well, as a matter of fact, you once wrote that we have 12,000 tariffs in place on all kinds of products, all across the board, from all kinds of countries, taxing the American people for all kinds of products that we use every day.
Yeah, and including the 25% tariff that started in the 60s with what's called the chicken tax. We have a 25% tariff on imported pickup trucks. And so that gives GM and Ford and Chrysler about an 83% market share of that very valuable market. More than half the vehicles sold are trucks, and so they get this protection.
Now, does that mean the cost is higher for the American consumer because of the tariff?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that would be the logical outcome, is that if a U.S. producer is protected from foreign competition, then there's going to be, less choice. And I always say Perry's law is competition breeds competence. So the more competition there is, the more competent and productive and efficient our producers would be.
And if there's a 25% tax on pickup trucks that would otherwise be shipped into our country, what's to stop a domestic producer from saying, fine, now we're going to increase our price 23%. In other words, we're under the 25%. They talk about an open playing field. They have an open playing field then, don't they?
Well, that's right. And so to the extent that they're protected from more efficient foreign producers, then they would be able to charge higher prices to Americans. And basically with the 25% tariff on pickup trucks, no pickup trucks even come into the country because it's just so cost prohibitive. They couldn't be competitive.
But let's get back to this dairy example that the president uses.
Yeah.
My question to you is this. If one country makes it prohibitively expensive for their people to purchase something from us, aren't there other countries we can sell them to?
Well, that's one good point, is that in a global market, just because Canada doesn't, if they don't really welcome our exports of dairy products, that, it's a big world that we can sell them elsewhere. And then to the extent that they're penalizing and taxing their consumers in the form of higher prices for milk and dairy products, it wouldn't make sense for us to retaliate and charge our consumer higher prices and by imposing tariffs. So this whole retaliation, it doesn't make sense that if they're going to commit economic suicide, it shouldn't mean that we would have self-inflicted economic suicide.
This is a very important point. What you're saying, just to underscore it, is if other countries want to drive up taxes on their own consumers, those taxes go to their government. And I want people to understand, when we put tariffs in place, we're not only taxing the American people, driving up the cost of our products, the government gets the money. It's not like some industry gets the money, the government gets the money. If a country wants to do that to its own people, you're saying, why should we do that to our people? Well,
that's right. And it is a form of a tax, and we always you look at the headlines. So the U.S. is going to impose tariffs on China. It's not on China.
We're going to get to China, because you and I may disagree on China, but let's talk about our allies.
Yeah, or, okay, so we're going to tax steel from Canada or from Europe. That's not a tax on them. They don't pay the tax. We can't impose a tax on a foreign company. It's the American companies who would import it into the U.S. who would pay the tax and then pass it along in the form of higher prices to American consumers and American companies who use that as an input.
Is there any question, really, that we're talking about special interest protectionism here with tariffs in many cases, whether it's the steel industry or the aluminum industry? And these are something, just being blunt about it, their unions have pushed for and so forth. The politicians, most of them that represent these areas, Bernie Sanders, this has been his philosophy. Chuck Schumer, this has been his philosophy. It's kind of new to conservatism, these across-the-board ideas of tariffs on our allies. But I guess my question is this. While it may, at least temporarily, protect those workers, aren't there more workers down economic stream who are using steel, and when you drive up the price of steel, more and more of those industries go out of business, or they cut back on R&D, they cut back on wages and benefits, or they cut back on employment, period?
Oh, sure. I mean, that's just the reality that I guess for every protected job in the U.S. steel industry, for workers who are making steel, there's something like 25 or 30 workers whose jobs are at risk now because their companies use steel as an input. And so it drives up the price of an input and makes them less competitive because, again, a lot of U.S. companies are not only selling here, they're selling globally. So you're driving up input prices for American companies. It makes them less competitive. They lose market share. They would then have less demand for workers. So again, that's the part that you have to kind of trace all of the effects through and not just look at the one steel worker whose job is now protected because of protectionism. We have to trace it through and look at all of the effects, the negative effects on the economy. And when you do that, I don't think you can, point to any case where the benefits of protectionism have outweighed the cost. It's always that the cost outweigh the benefits, or that the jobs lost are greater than the jobs saved.